it seems that these people are in the same world in a way, that
Right.
they're not cognizant of just how transparently satanic their program is.
O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
So what I delved into was the theological core, which is, this is just a repeat, and it's kind of unbelievably, to me, it's unbelievable how transparent it is. In other words, the people who are running with this, pushing transhumanism, it's as if they know, maybe you're going to tell me, they know just how obvious they're repeating the temptation of the serpent in the garden. The lie, you will become gods without God. It's so obvious to anybody who has a little literacy in biblical theology, cosmology, demonology, that they're just running with it. And when I saw recently, I saw an interview with a guy from Hollywood who was doing research into the roots of AI, and the guy he was talking about as kind of the father of AI was known to be, and he accepted the fact that he had 3 demons in him, and he was getting basically told by the demons how to do this thing.
So when I read Simon's interview with him, which is from 1998, and it's also where Simon meets the philosopher Mark Fisher, which I gotta relish, Tuck. This is probably the first and last time someone will bring up Mark Fisher on your podcast. So I want to take some time to enjoy that. But so Simon, he interviews Nick Land, and in his article, it's very lengthy. He talks about how Nick Land is possessed by 3 or 4 entities at the same time. That's the legend. We don't know. Take what you will about any of this, but that 3 or 4 entities at the same time. He's bringing up current
spiritual entities.
Yeah, demons. He's really into demons. He brings up the 93rd Current, which is the name of a band. Current 93, which is Aleister Crowley's Thelema. And they're drawing pentagrams. They're renting out Aleister Crowley's house. And so that was a huge moment for me, where I was like, wait a second. This guy that's very big in tech, very big on the future of AI. My buddy is interviewing him, and he's heavily into all these heavy industrial goth things that I know about from this research here. What's he doing in AI?
In other words, what I talked about earlier in my intro, that there's no dogmatic consciousness. It's total utter relativism, no truth. It seems that these people are in the same world in a way, that
Right.
They're not cognizant of just how transparently satanic their program is. Now, I don't mean to jump to the conclusion, but that was what I was focusing on. That, look, this is the temptation in the garden. Now, I want to hear you tell me about how we got there, or a lot more that you've done. But is that a part of your book? Is that a part of your research?
Yeah, I quote and reference you in chapter 4, because you did your thing on transhumanism. As an article that I found on Orthodox Ethos, because I was searching any clergy. I was desperate to find Orthodox clergy speaking on the topic so I could quote them. And yours was one that I quote, I think, in the first and second sections in chapter 4. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned, are these people conscious of the satanic inversion? I would say some of them are. And some of them use it as just a semiotic reference. So Max Moore, who's considered one of the founding philosophers of transhumanism, he developed a philosophy called extropy, meaning their transhumanism and his endeavors are against the entropy of the universe. And therefore, it's this trajectory towards ultimate life. And he wrote an article called In Praise of the Devil, where he basically takes it's kind of like a juvenile 16-year-old atheist perspective, where he's, the God of Christianity is mean, he's vindictive, he prevents us from becoming illuminated and enlightened, and therefore he refers to Lucifer, Satan, and the devil all as a sort of Promethean hero. But he then says, well, of course, I don't believe these things have ontological existence. But the mimetic power is that we need to incorporate Satan and Lucifer as a way so that people can see transhumanism as a liberating light. And when I was living in Berkeley, which is not far from the Silicon Valley, we actually had a class on new religious movements and Western esoteric traditions. And we were to find local local representations of these faiths. And one of the woman who was also a co-PhD student with me, she was a Thelemite. So that means she's part of the Temple of Thelema, which is the tradition founded by Aleister Crowley. And one of the things that I came to become aware of that I was not aware of is how popular the occult is among Silicon Valley. It was actually the most popular form of spirituality, was a mixture between New Age and explicit occult or esoteric ritual practice. And so when the people were interested in spirituality, it definitely wasn't returning back to an Orthodox phronem or anything that's traditional. There was a great excitement about incorporating esoteric rituals in a sort of secularized context that they reincorporate as a form of self-power. They're re-empowering themselves. Now, of course, the power that they claim to have is obviously a demonic influence. But there's also traditions that are explicitly religious within transhumanism. I talked about the Terrorism trans religion, which was founded by Martine Rothblatt. She's a transgender woman, so it's a biological man, founder of Sirius Satellite Radio, all this different stuff. And they have headquarters in Florida. And if you went there, they basically have icons on the wall, but it's all people like Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil and Peter Thiel and these type of individuals. Because of the technological contributions they've made, they believe that they're paving the way for this utopian world. And so I question, because, and we can get into some of the philosophy behind transhuman, why they even think that this thing is possible, because the entire enterprise of transhumanism is built on a theoretical understanding of mind, which is it's not like the philosophy of mind has come to a new conclusion, a new turn in philosophy where this is a cornerstone truth. No, they take the theory that functionalism is the case.
Too much further in. Tell us how people can obtain the book.
So at my website, I only sell hard copies, and those are signed. And if there's something in particular you want me to write or as a message, you can put that in the message when you check out on my website. It is a little bit more expensive. It helps me make a little bit more money on each book. But if you want a cheaper, difficult times right now in the economy, you can go to Amazon. So if you just put in Return to Babylon, it'll pop up Return to Babylon, Adam from Antichrist. Or if you just put in David Patrick Harry, it'll pop up. And they have, there's a Kindle version and then a paperback and a hardback.
Well, we want to support you. And so I encourage everybody to go to the website and get the book from you and get the signed copy and have the hardcover. It's always better to have a hardcover.
And functionalism basically just argues that if something can perform the same function as a human brain, it has a functional equivalence. So a calculator can do 2 + 2 = 4. You can do that in your brain. The calculator then has a functional equivalence, or release regarding that project or that endeavor. And so the idea then for them, as long as the machine can output and function the same as a human brain, it is equivalently the same thing. That's their argument. And therefore, if they can build, this is their belief, enough interconnections within the AI system, the emergent phenomenon will be a sort of sentience, because that's what they believe happens in us, is that the neurons become so interconnected. And from a child until you reach like self-awareness, that what is happening is that the information of the environment is causing the neuronal connections to eventually emerge into the experience that I have the sense of I'm a self and I am a thinking thing. And they believe that that's exactly what the machine's going to do. Now,
so just let me stop you a minute. So the total materialists, and yet they have a occult aspect, some of them. So how do they square that?
Well, some of them are explicit. So like William Sims Bainbridge, he's actually a sociologist. If you go to university and do like a sociology 101, he'll be one of the people that you'll probably read one of his books. Well, he is a transhumanist, and he's very much in favor of transhumanism. And they are explicitly talking about how transhumanism, they need to incorporate occult, spirit, new age spiritual elements to surround it so that it truly can supplant religion as it exists today. And for them, it's not even that you have to do this major conversion. They just want you to assume the transhuman eschatology within your spiritual worldview. And so I don't know if you saw last week, Joe Rogan did an interview. Joe Rogan's now going to a Christian church somewhere around Austin. It's some type of, rock band entertainment experience, but he's talking about how much he likes it, how he likes the people. And then in the next sentence talks about how, I believe, Jesus was born of a virgin. I think that the AI, when it becomes sentient, that is the second coming of Jesus.
People think this is a stupid take, but I don't care. Jesus was born out of a virgin mother. What's more virgin than a computer? So if you're going to get the most brilliant, loving, powerful person that gives us advice and can show us how to live, to be in sync with God, who better than artificial intelligence to do that? Wow. If Jesus does return, even if Jesus was a physical person in the past, you don't think that he could return as artificial intelligence?
Oh my God.
Artificial intelligence could absolutely return as Jesus. Not just return as Jesus, but return as Jesus with all the powers of Jesus.
And that's exactly what transhumanists actually want, and what they think is going to occur. It doesn't matter if you're a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, is that the AI and what they believe the teleology of where it's going is the fulfillment. It's the tactile fulfillment of religion itself. They believe all mythology is sort of wishful human imagination. But what they're building is something that you can actually touch. And so they are instantiating the thing that all religion and all mythology have been speculating about or desiring. That's the way that they would perceive it, is that this is sort of the fanciful desire of human transcendence. And what they're offering is the actual thing. And so they don't care where you're coming from. They think they can blend it all into it. And so one of the ironies is that Mormonism was the very first religion, I think, as early as like 1997, to found their own Mormon Transhumanist Association. Lincoln Cannon, so he's the sort of head of that, he believes that to be Mormon is to be transhuman, but to be transhuman doesn't necessarily mean that you're Mormon. And he argues that Mormon theology itself insinuates, because, for them, God the Father was an entity that evolved into divinity, that they then, and every Mormon is on that same trajectory, right? It's a concept of deification, and technology is something that can be used in that process. That transhumanism then is the fulfillment of Mormon theology. That's his argument. And there's people there in Tennessee, actually in Nashville, there's what's called the Christian Transhumanist Association. Now, these people are like non-denominational Protestants, but they have been putting on conferences in the last 5 years or so with Aubrey de Grey. He's the longevity researcher. He's been on Joe Rogan before. And they are trying to incorporate Christianity and argue that transhumanism is the fulfillment of us getting to the millennial kingdom. And as we'll get into the specifics of my book, chapter 1 is all about tracing how did transhumanism come to emerge as a believable concept. And I didn't realize the Christian origins of that. So trying to actually dive in, it took me two and a half years to actually finish this. So a full year, over a year, just reading as many books as I could find on the topic. And turns out, and we'll get into it because it's kind of its own separate conversation, it emerges out of a Christian heresy, this idea that man creating machine is actually going to endow him with the Adamic prelapsarian abilities. And by attaining those, we actually return back to the end of, we arrive at the end of history, I guess, which for them is the same point in which history began. So history is a kind of a circle, and by man's own machinations and building through technology, we will then return back to where we began, and essentially history is complete. The second coming of Christ is complete. I created the research project. The way you go about it, you create a whole document with reading sources that it's kind of theoretical. This is what I think I'm going to present here, and then you go do all the research. And I framed it as a distinction between theosis and transhumanism, not realizing until I dove into all the reading that that was actually quite pertinent, because so many books, I mean, I would say definitely over half, but the vast majority, if you see the term theosis mentioned, it's a correlation with transhumanism, that somehow this is what early first millennial Christians were actually aiming towards. And so the delineation between these things is, I mean, that's what my book is doing, is highlighting these are actually inversions of each other.
Yeah.
And that's what chapter 4 is doing. So my book is kind of it's kind of a long climax, because the climax is at the end of the book. The first chapter, and I think is quite fascinating, the history of how these ideas actually emerge. And I end it at the very end of the 19th century, so the beginning of the 20th century. And I demonstrate how these concepts move from explicitly theological Western Christian concepts. And then eventually once you get to the Renaissance, it takes on more esoteric framework. So the Rosicrucian movement, the Illuminati of Weishaupt, the speculative Freemasonry. Kabbalah, absolutely. Kabbalah is part of it, because that whole point that man is sort of returning back to his divinity is the whole crux of it. And so the reason why I call it from Adam to Antichrist, let me just be explicit, is that what is the heresy I keep mentioning? Because I was going to dive into chapter 1. The heresy is in the 800s. So again, for us Orthodox, the year 800 is quite important. That's the year that Charlemagne made his pact with the Pope to found the false Holy Roman Empire, right? Obviously, the Roman Empire already existed at that time.
Indeed.
And so during the 800s to 900, this 100-year period, it's kind of forgotten, but is actually an incredibly important point in Western history. And this is called the Carolingian era. Some scholars refer to it as the Carolingian Renaissance, because there was so much technological and cultural innovation during this 100-year period. Now, this is pre-schism for us. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the schism's already emerging at this point in history, but this is pre-schism. And in the mid-800s, there's a gentleman named John Scotus Erigena. He was an Irish Neoplatonist, and he was the only man in the Holy Roman Empire that was fluent in Greek and Latin and had access to people like St. Maximus the Confessor, Dionysius the Areopagite, and he had translated some of their stuff into Latin. He was one of the few people to have done that. And so he very fascinated with deification, our theosis, Neoplatonism. I mean, that was kind of his foundational presupposition, and then Western Christianity. And he came to the belief because during this period, so this is around 860, there's an invention of the heavy plow. There was new methods for forging swords, which made their swords stronger than people in the Middle East or in Asia. Blacksmithing, tanning, all these different things. They had new ways to go about this. And because of this, and he saw the growth of it, he believed that technology was going to be the way in which we returned back to Adam, and that everything that Adam lost due to the fall, so we would consider spiritual properties, he believed that mechanical technology would redeem us. Now, you wouldn't think that would actually catch on, but that was a very interesting, and right during that point, the Benedictines, so ora et labora, prayer and labor, was also a novel concept in the West, this idea that labor was actually spiritually uplifting.
Too much further in. Tell us how people can obtain the book.
So at my website, I only sell hard copies, and those are signed. And if there's something in particular you want me to write or as a message, you can put that in the message when you check out on my website. It is a little bit more expensive. It helps me make a little bit more money on each book. But if you want a cheaper, difficult times right now in the economy, you can go to Amazon. So if you just put in Return to Babylon, it'll pop up, Return to Babylon, Adam from Antichrist. Or if you just put in David Patrick Harry, it'll pop up. And they have, there's a Kindle version and then a paperback and a hardback.
Well, we want to support you. And so I encourage everybody to go to the website and get the book from you and get the signed copy and have the hardcover. It's always better to have the hardcover.
Before this, as I highlight in my book, for Plato and Aristotle and all of classical thinking, universal abstract thought was deemed higher than specific understanding of like how to make a chair. The understanding the process of writing and what language means for them was more true and more valuable than being able to craft a pen or some type of they viewed that as the work of slaves, that anybody could be trained to do those things, but not everybody could understand the universal meaning. And this all gets shifted with John Scotus Erigena. He reevaluates the importance of what he calls the mechanical arts, artis mechanicae. And so it's the mechanical arts that now get valorized. You have the Benedictines, which become the monastic standard in the West. You get John Scotus Erigena saying, actually, all these novelties are unique. And so as I highlight, the Utrecht Psalter is the first representation during this period in the 800s ever that we have in Western art where God has a compass and scale in his hand. And the Psalter identifies the Christians as using this new method for sharpening their swords and the enemies of God using the older methods. And this set a new precedence even among monastics that God was bestowing the West with technological advance to fight the enemies of the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, oh yeah, your mic's definitely on now. I can hear it.
Oh, immediately, huh? I didn't say anything. So we got a different browser. I think we're good. All right.
Camera and your mic definitely just came back on.
All right, fantastic, good.
So what I was just to finish this thought, it's with John Scotus Erigena newly valorizes the mechanical arts. Then we get people like Hugh of St. Victor in the following century doing the exact same thing, building upon John Scotus Erigena. Then we get Joachim of Fiore, which wasn't, his stuff was never associated explicitly with technology, but he, as you know, was a dispensationalist heretic who claimed to have some prophecy about the era of the Father.
Well, go ahead. Can I ask a question, because I'm fascinated with this, because I read some of the scholars that you're talking about, but Fiore seemed to be another world.
Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, isn't there, because you just mentioned, who'd you just mention?
Roger Bacon, Hugh of St. Victor.
Yeah. So Hugh of St. Victor actually in my studies, which is not related to transhumanism, was pretty orthodox in most stuff. So I'm surprised that he is a stepping stone in this dissolution.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm also surprised at the image that you're talking about that actually kind of passes an Orthodox icon, right? Where the Lord has got the, what does he have in his hand that you mentioned?
Compass and scale.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that the famous icon? It's kind of an iconographic description, is it not? Or is it really Western?
It's more Western. Yeah.
It is more Western. Okay. But I'm just curious, where's the breaking point? Where do we jump off the ledge into, is it with Fiore that really we kind of are propelled into another cosmology, or is it?
I would say that there's one more link, and this is the Age of Discovery. And so it's Joachim of Fiore that lays out these prophecies that there's the age of the Father, which is from Adam to Christ, essentially. Right. Then you have Christ to what he believed is his time, because he believed he was a prophet. And this is the 1100s. That was the age of Christ. That was the age of the church. The third age is the age of the Holy Spirit, and that's the age of holy men. And so he actually believed that the sacraments were no longer needed. Clergy wasn't necessarily necessary. Basically it's a proto-Protestantism.
Wow. Wow. I didn't know that he said the sacraments no longer needed. That's wild.
He diminished the importance of the sacraments, because in the age of spiritual men, the Holy Spirit dwells perfectly within each spiritual man, right? So you don't need the sacraments to engage with the Spirit. The Spirit's within you due to your correct understanding.
Now he's just before Francis of Assisi, kind of a predecessor to Francis of Assisi in some ways.
In some ways, yeah. I would say the person who really becomes the voice for Joachim, because he, and I have in here Ernst Benz, multiple scholars highlighting that Joachim of Fiore's theory of the age of spiritual men is the most important prophecy or philosophical system until Marxism. They consider Marx as a type of like utopian prophecy, and they said that Joachim of Fiore not only influenced, we're going to talk about Roger Bacon, who was an alchemist, all this different stuff, but influenced all the reformers. All the reformers believed that what they were doing when they broke away from the Catholic Church is they were inaugurating the age of spiritual men, the third age. Wow. And that's why Protestantism from the get-go was already so eschatologically focused, because they truly believed that their breaking away was bringing about the millennial kingdom. Anyway, just to sum up real quick. So from Joachim of Fiore, you get Roger Bacon. He was a devout reader of Joachim of Fiore and believed that the Antichrist was just around the corner. Well, I highlight, and I mentioned this in Florida, Christopher Columbus. He believed that he was the prophet of Joachimite prophecy. And that's why his job was to extend the knowable world so that it would end history. He believed that his expansion into what we would consider South America, North America, he believed what he was doing was going to return back to the Mount Zion and establish the end of history itself. So where does the break, all this medieval mixture with this concept break? I would say it's fully broken with Francis Bacon. He takes all these ideas and they become a little bit more rational. It's less spiritually focused. It's less prophetically focused. It's more, hey, look at, the Baconian revolution, for those who don't know, is that knowledge during Francis Bacon, he's considered the father of empiricism, but why he is so important and influential is he revolutionized how we come to know things. Before Francis Bacon, it was the scholastic tradition, which was basically Aristotelian logic and syllogisms is how we know something is true. With Francis Bacon, utility becomes the way in which we know something to be true, because you make something and it does the thing that you want it to do. That's the ultimate demonstration that you know something, not the ability to say it could do it through a syllogism or a theoretical structure. It's to actually do it. So you can see from Plato and Aristotle's understanding of who has higher knowledge to Francis Bacon, that table is totally flipped. And now with Francis Bacon, you get this utilitarian push for knowledge. And he has a book called New Atlantis. And in New Atlantis, the millennial kingdom would be found in the West. New Atlantis actually takes place in North America. Now, this is before, 1776, so it's not America, but it is the territory that Spain had already, at that point, they would have already had St. Augustine as a military fort would already been built. The British would have already known, Roanoke, in some of these Jamestown, some of these early colonies. He argued that land over there is where the millennial kingdom is going to be built. And so in his book, New Atlantis, which is a utopian novel, he actually died before completing it. And in that, it talks about these shipwrecked mariners or find themselves in North America, and they get helped by this community of people who have this sort of Christian brotherly love, but they all practice a science. They all make something. They all are sort of technologically sophisticated. And what these shipwrecked mariners from Europe realize is that they live in utopia. There's a universal basic income. You don't have to work. They have all these these machines that are built, and everybody studies a science. And so this was his New Atlantis. Now, once we move from Francis Bacon, that is really the end of, the Western esoteric tradition. So King James of England, who was James of Scotland, when he becomes King James of England, he despised the occult. He is the founder of the King James Bible. And he was fascinated with the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel because he was focused on the end times. He was very much eschatologically focused. And John Dee, let's say 50 years before James takes the throne, he was the court astrologer. He was the sine qua non of Elizabethan British royalty. He's the basis of the 007 agent, and he did all these occult rituals. That's a whole nother conversation. If you don't know John Dee, go into that stuff. I don't want to dive into that. But John Dee, for King James, he elevated what he considered demonic arts. And so because James hated them so much, John Dee actually died in disgrace and poverty and much of his stuff taken from him. And so King James was not interested in any of that legacy. And Francis Bacon, being very close to King James, knew this. And so there's a Frances Yates, who has, she was a famous scholar that focused on this period, the Rosicrucians and Giordano Bruno and all that stuff. She argues that Francis Bacon was part and parcel of the Rosicrucian movement. Now, any public presentation of that, he discredited. And this is why he found favor in the court of King James. Now, King James, because he hated this, all this esoteric John Dee, Paracelsian, alchemical understanding of nature and technology basically gets sanitized. And by 1660, we have the founding of the Royal Society. So for 20 years before that, you have the English Civil War. And where King James takes the throne at the beginning of the 1600s. By 1660, now we have King Charles II, and science emerges as we understand it today. And science emerges out of this occult understanding about moving towards the millennial kingdom and restoring man back to his pure divinity. That was what the Rosicrucian movement was about. That was the whole premise of it. That was the whole premise of the Illuminati movement as well.
In terms of the timeline, where are we in terms of the Illuminati on the continent? We're about 100 years after the Illuminati supposedly was founded.
Yeah. Basically about 100 years later. So I always tell people that the 16th century is the most magical century in European history, which most people don't realize. But it's because the Corpus Hermeticum was translated in 1470 by Marsilio Ficino, and Cosimo de' Medici wanted to read that before he read Plato. Plato hadn't even been fully translated into Latin. And before he died, he said, I need to read Hermes, because they believed that the older something was, the truer it was. And they believed that Hermes Trismegistus was older than Moses. And therefore, all revelation moving forward, they believe becomes diminished in some way. So the older it is, the better it is. It's sort of classicist understanding. Well, that leads to then the 16th century. Not only is the Protestant Reformation 1517, but all of the Paracelsian alchemy, all of Christian Kabbalah, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, that stuff's at the end of the 1400s. And so when we think of the European wizard alchemist, we're thinking of the archetype of the 1600s or the 1500s, the 16th century. And so after all the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, the Illuminati, Paracelsian alchemy, all this different stuff, Henry Cornelius Agrippa, the 3 books of occultism, all this stuff is written in the 1500s. By the 1600s, especially in England, they're like, no, this stuff is not going to go publicly anymore. And that is why they created the Royal Society. And essentially all this esoteric stuff splits and it goes into the speculative Freemason lodges. And then popular science is sanitized from any sort of spiritual milieu. And
you pointed out that there's it's debatable whether Bacon was a part of the Rosicrucians, but you think he was.
I think he was certainly knowledgeable about it, because all the people he worked with, they were part and parcel of it.
Too much further in. Tell us how people can obtain the book.
So at my website, I only sell hard copies, and those are signed. And if there's something in particular you want me to write or as a message, you can put that in the message when you check out on my website. It is a little bit more expensive. It helps me make a little bit more money on each book. But if you want a cheaper, difficult times right now in the economy, you can go to Amazon. So if you just put in Return to Babylon, it'll pop up. Return to Babylon, Adam from Antichrist. Or if you just put in David Patrick Harry, it'll pop up. And they have, there's a Kindle version and then a paperback and a hardback.
Well, we want to support you. And so I encourage everybody to go to the website and get the book from you and get the signed copy and have the hardcover. It's always better to have the hardcover.
What about this theory that the Baconians or a group of them were also basically behind Shakespeare? Is that fanciful, or is there some legitimacy?
I don't know. That's another theory. I don't really have a hard.
How extensive of an impact is Bacon? Basically, what I'm trying to get is he just the man behind the scenes, behind the curtain, pulling all the strings, or is that all just revisionist history? You think?
I mean, I personally think William Shakespeare probably existed.
Okay.
But
because it's interesting how impactful Shakespeare was, right? I mean, very impactful, and he didn't have a lot of Christian overtones,
right?
so I'm just, maybe it's the same spirit, and that's why it all seems to kind of converge. But I've always been curious about that, and the other thing is, as you're talking, what I hear again and again is utopian. That's exactly what Father Seraphim Rose says was the defining thing of the. It's all millennialism. It's Chiliasm. Chiliasm is the defining heretical outlook, and we'll just it'll end in the Antichrist and in transhumanism. But you see it in all the stuff you're talking about. And of course, in the Protestant Reformation, you have tons of attempts at a utopian, attempt at making the perfect society on earth, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not something outside of the Christian Protestant milieu at all, right?
No, it's not. And that's where, because the diminution of Christianity in the West, and because once 1660 arises, and that's why we have the scientific revolution. Now we have actual scientific societies, and you're not allowed to talk about theology because of the English Civil War. The first rule, it's like Fight Club. First rule is you don't speak about Fight Club. The first rule of the Royal Society is we do not debate theology or even mention it.
Wow.
You can only do science. Because
it's fascinating. It's fascinating how the various currents all serve the evisceration of the Christian worldview in the West. right? The way I described it, I don't know if it's accurate, and it goes along with dovetails on what you're saying, is that what essentially happens from the Pope on, really, the schism on, but especially since the Reformation, is you have a pendulum swing from one extreme to another, and that becomes the wrecking ball of all holy tradition, and that becomes essentially what then destroys the Christian cosmotheoria to allow for the birth of the anti-Christian scientific cosmotheoria. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now at that point, the England, Europe was still Christian, but like to the real point you're making, it's the intellectual currents of the time, right? Yes, the average person in England still viewed themselves as a very devout Christian, pious Christian. The intelligentsia was moving away from it because they're always looking at what's the next project, what's the evolution, where are we going with this? And so once you get to the scientific revolution, now you have this idea of these utopian societies where science is going to solve all things. Once you move into the Enlightenment, once we get into the 1700s and really about the time of the founding of America, it moves into engineering. So you find all these engineering schools, and I highlight this in this trajectory, and it's the engineer that replaces the alchemist, just like the alchemist replaced, the prophet or the priest in the medieval period. And so now it's not just science, it's not just measuring and averaging, it's not just studying biology, it's the engineer who builds machines. And so Augustus Comte, in his positive theology, this is what the whole basis of it was, is that there was this fervor, especially in France, but in England and Germany. France was the world's leader in engineering at the time. They had all these engineering schools, and many of them were all Masons, speculative Masons. But they were explicit, and I quote them in chapter 1, how they believed that the engineer was going to bring man back to Adam. Right. So the whole running theme through my whole chapter 1 is I'm trying to find quotes of these individuals that enumerate this idea that we're going to return back to Adam. Right. Which obviously is not orthodox. And I highlight that in our speech because we want to return to Christ.
Right.
We don't look to Adam as like this ideal entity of who we want to return to. But that is the basis of this whole concept, which no
talk of the new Adam. The new Adam is no longer.
No talk of the new Adam. It's about we got to get back to the old Adam, which makes sense as we'll get into explicitly with transhumanism, because they're remaking themselves into the machine. They're destroying the imago Dei for the machine, which if you want to get to if the old Adam is the ideal, you're moving in the opposite direction. The ontological trajectory of man is moving in reverse. It's not moving forward towards the eternal God.
Right.
And so just to summarize and end that conversation on the history part, I highlight how engineering then becomes to fulfill this role. Like it's the engineer, especially in the later half of the 18th century, that they believe is going to solve all things. And much of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, I highlight, was absolutely part of this general ethos that by understanding nature and the engineer and building things, we're going to move into a utopia. And so I move at the very last shift in chapter 1 to America. And I highlight how America was seen as the shining city on the hill, whether it be Plymouth Rock from the Puritans, but everybody moving forward. And I highlighted all these different descriptions.
So this is really France and England mainly in terms of who we're talking about intellectually.
Yes. Mostly
no involvement of the Mediterranean. A lot of people.
No. Yeah. No, I didn't find anything regarding Orthodox saints, Orthodox clergy,
or even Catholicism. Not a lot of Catholic, Roman Catholic.
There was Catholics speaking out against this stuff, but at the same time, the problem with the Catholic Church is the Protestant North was so damn productive. What are they going to do? How can they argue against it? Right. And so and that's where you get the Industrial Revolution and basically separate. And still today, the GDP of Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, you can see it right there, because we can get into the Protestant work ethic, Max Weber witnessing this change and seeing how the Protestants work so hard because they don't have sacraments and confession. They are working out their salvation through their labor.
So it's interesting you talk about the rise of the engineers in the 1700s, basically, right? So setting the stage for the 1800s, which is the birth of the Industrial Revolution, essentially, right?
Yeah, and socialism. Right. So now so then you get socialism in the 1800s. And I highlight at the very end of chapter 1 there that focusing on America, because America then takes on the promise that it's going to fulfill this utopian millennial kingdom. And I have all these engineers, the leading engineers of America, all stating the same thing about Adam, that they're going to return back to Adam. And there's a famous book by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backwards. And it was the most popular book at the time, only to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what it is,
what years in America?
Like 1870.
The other thing that struck me before you go on, and don't forget that part of the timeline, is that when the rise of the engineers didn't happen except in Western Europe, essentially. I mean, you don't have that in the Orthodox world, really. No. So I'm thinking to myself, what gave birth to that? Is it not scholasticism in the sense that they're now the whole method first, right? The method is not that much different. We're going to sit down and analyze speculatively and structurally, and we're going to look at things in a rationalistic way, and we're going to talk about the world and God's creation and God himself from that perspective, from the scholastic rationalistic approach to God, and not the experiential theology. So they're saying, well, okay, you're doing that with regard to the heavenly things. We're going to do that with regard to the earthly things. The methodologies and the idea of how we achieve progress is not all that different, right? We're just focusing on creation as opposed to the creator. Is that accurate, or would that be just kind of? I'm trying to figure out where does this love and rise of engineers come in a society? I mean, they're no longer looking to heaven; they're looking entirely to the earth. So,
yeah.
So what's
the presuppositional shift had to do with Bacon's utilitarian pursuit of knowledge. I mean, it's hard to understate how revolutionary that was in Europe at the time. I mean, we don't get Kant and his critique of pure reason and metaphysics without Bacon shifting the way in which, especially England, especially the Anglosphere, understood what knowledge is, which turns into utility. And so because of that, and then because England was then taking off compared to the rest of Europe, France also then, with this engineering, they see that they take the abstract, the universal, and they then instantiate it into physical things that make life better and more productive.
So they just didn't have any saints to tell them the vanity of it all? That was what they were missing?
I mean, yeah. I mean, Auguste Comte, he would say that he is the saint. It moves into this ideal. I mean, by the late 1700s and early 1800s, you have engineers in France talking about a purely mechanical man. It's that early. 200 years before transhumanism is actually, they didn't have the digital technology. So they're talking very much a robotic, like machine man, but there was already a concept that a machine man could always be upgraded and he would never die. And that this was something that they needed to pursue, which I connect back with all the Golem myths and Jew, the famous rabbi in Prague and Golem. And that was a thing in Judaism, that if you were a very erudite rabbi, you could essentially co-create life. And that concept was embedded in all that esoteric lore. I mean, do
you see any signs of these atheist, agnostic, engineer having connection to Kabbalah or?
Oh yeah.
Or I don't know what. I mean, the theory, just a non-Christian cosmotheory, and not just a rejection of Christianity, but an adoption of that self-deification mentality.
Absolutely.
We're going into origins of transhumanism, basically. Is that where we're at in terms of
I'm getting ready to bridge it right into actual transhumanism.
Okay.
And so in America, Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward, in the 1870s, 1880s, was talking about basically Costco's, massive supermarkets where you could buy in bulk. You paid with a credit card. You watched entertainment on a screen at home, TV.
What?
Yeah.
What? In the 1870s, you're talking about?
Yes. It's called Edward Bellamy's. It's called Looking Backward, and he was a socialist utopian, and this created political movements. Like if you look into the impact of the book Looking Backward in America, It was incredibly impactful. These new socialist movements popped up because they saw that if we could, so of course it's UBI stuff, universal basic income. You don't have to work, are doing most of the labor. You get to live a life of leisure. And this is what it means to live in the millennial kingdom, essentially. And so he writes this book. And about a decade later, after this is, again, one of the best sellers, it's only to Uncle Tom's Cabin is it below in regard to the amount of copies sold. He laments the fact that in America, he said the problem that he lost all his sort of socialist utopian dreams because in America, what he saw was that Americans only cared about the latest innovation and they didn't care whether it benefited people or not, right? I mean, irony. This is like in 1890, he's writing this. The irony is, and today people are camping out for the latest iPhone. Again, not concerned whether it's good for them or not, but because there's a new innovation.
It's currently 7 a.m. and we're here at iPhone launch day. There's actually tons of people waiting in line. All right, so there's actually tons of people waiting in line already. With this being this early, these are all the people that are actually doing the pre-orders already. And the line even goes all the way down there.
And he was characterizing that this was uniquely part of the American mind in the 1890s. And so he said, because Americans only care about innovation, they don't care about how the innovations can be used to amplify us as individuals and human beings, that this is going to be doomed, that technology is actually going to entrap us. That's what he was worried about. And so that's the end of the 19th century. In the 20th century, where we get the first time in history the word transhumanism comes from Julian Huxley in a 1957 book called New Bottles for New Wine. And at the end of the 1920s, he had written a book called Religion Without Revelation, where he's talking about how what the West needs now is a religion without revelation. Essentially, the myths of Christianity, they're socially good. Religion has a utility for society, but it's just not believable anymore. And so we need to create a new religion, a religion without revelation. And now you fast forward 30 years or 20 some years later to the 1957 book. And he says, you know what this new religion is? It's called transhumanism. It's humans transcending their biological limitations. That's the point of all this stuff. That's the faith we need. And that's going to liberate us from essentially what he viewed as the problems with being a man in space and time. And so from 1957, and then once you start getting into the 1960s and 1970s, you get the cybernetics movement, which is this idea that, we can actually influence human beings based on digital or technological feedback loops. Stoplights are an example of a cybernetic feedback. The light's red, you act in a certain way. You come to a stop, the light turns green, you move. And there's a feedback, just like your thermostat in your house. And they were contemplating this in New York, the greatest thinkers of the time in the 20th century, thinking, how can we create technologies to create cybernetic feedback loops to make man better? And so now you're getting the idea that technology is merging with this sort of techno-humanism.
Make man better, or just manipulate him into a particular.
Well, the rhetoric is the making better, right? Yeah. But again, you ask what worldview are these people coming from? Well, mostly secular, rationalist, materialist. Some, maybe a perennial spiritual. They may label themselves Christian or Jewish, but it's a very perennial. Just like you said with the rabbi,
right?
So. Then once you get into the cybernetic movement, and then in the 1980s, you get Werner Vinge mentioning the word singularity. Jean von Neumann is the first person to really mention the concept of the singularity. Von Neumann was working with the Manhattan Project and all these sort of black projects with the U.S. government. Well, at the end of the 1950s, he said, well, what we're doing, he's kind of the father of the computer and all this stuff. He said, what we're doing, and this was right before he died, this is according to his best friend, we're moving to a point with the exponential growth of technology where it's essentially going to be able to fix itself. And once that happens, that is essentially going to be the end of history. Well, that was the idea. And then Werner Vinge characterized that as the singularity. Once you get into the 1990s and the early 2000s, Ray Kurzweil then takes the mantle. Max Moore really establishes and cements transhumanism as a philosophical orientation in the 1990s. So he talks about extropy. He develops this philosophy that we are critical realists. That's his epistemology. We're critical realists, meaning that truth, because he believes that truth is relative. He's against the tradition of metaphysics. He's against the idea that there's objective moral truths, but he's a critical rationalist, meaning that through science, they can come to an understanding of how the world works. And if something new emerges, then they move to that. But again, there's no metaphysical grounding for any of this stuff. It's not really sophisticated philosophy. And then their anthropology is this functionalist understanding of mind. So what is metaphysics? Well, it's functionalism, and therefore it's tying us back into the machine. The metaphysics for them, in chapter 4, I describe it as henosis, which is a Neoplatonic word for everything being subsumed back into the one. They are Neoplatonic. It's just materialism, though. There is no metaphysical henosis. It's material. I mean, their endpoint is everything is connected back to the AI. So
sounds like a little bit of Eastern mysticism in there.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and you could call it Eastern mysticism or Neoplatonism. It's the same idea that there's non-duality, right? Yeah. It's moving to a non-dual state. And that's ultimately what they believe is where they're moving to. And that's how they're going to get out of the duality of life and death, right? How do we get out of the dualities of existence itself? Well, we move into the machine where we can control all these things and you can choose. So and I highlight in my book that theurgy of the Neoplatonists. I mean, Iamblichus talked about how you can, indwell statues with daemons for them. I mean, demons for us. It's really just a semantic distinction, but
kind of like Miaphysite and Monophysite.
Yeah. And the Corpus Hermeticum, the book Asclepius, is about Hermes teaching his student Asclepius of how to put daemons into statues. And so the idea that they're going to theurgically create or make God act, I tie that to all these writings of these transhumanists, because they're very theurgic. I mean, they literally believe they're creating God. They're bringing God into existence. They're giving God a physical body. So
obviously it's not anything like any classical religion idea of God. It's really the demons that they're talking about. It's demonic power that they're manipulating or something. I mean, right?
For some of them, somebody like some of these guys that are into the occult would be okay with that. They probably wouldn't put the demons in a value judgment, right? So I definitely believe they're talking to demons or they're influenced by demons. They would say,
but the demons are like God, they're godlike, or what are they? What are they? Creations of another God? They don't have that.
They don't believe in a metaphysical God. They believe that and again, it depends on which transhumanist you're asking. If you ask somebody like Nick Bostrom, Max Moore, Peter Thiel, I mean, Peter Thiel kind of says he's Christian or something, but Elon Musk, for example, they'd say, well, the idea of all the religions that believe in God, that's not the God we're creating. We're actually just creating an entity that has all those characteristics. He's omnipresent. He's omnipotent.
Right.
And so they believe they're physically constructing the thing that everybody has theorized that God would be like. And so
superhuman, superhuman powers, things that have, so in a way they're humanists who want to do away with humans.
Yes, that's actually how they identify themselves. So transhumanism hates the postmodernist. So so you wouldn't think that, because you think, oh, these transhumanists, they're kind of, from our perspective, our presupposition, they have relativism, they have subjectivism. No, they hate the postmodernists because they believe the postmodernists do not lead to any sort of growth. The transhumanists view themselves as the endpoint of modernity. They view themselves as the completion of modernity. They are explicit that they're humanists, and therefore they're not postmodernists, right? They're not decentering the man as the anthropological subject. That's really the difference, right? So humanism is focusing that man is the sole source of all inquiry. For transhumanists, they're saying that's exactly what we're doing. We are humanists. The only difference is they are part of a movement, not only post-genderism, but post-humanity. So they're humanists that are focused on elevating humanity into a post-human existence.
So it's kind of like the next stage in the evolutionary ascent.
That's exactly what they believe. And if you're going to say a God that they believe in, most would probably be okay if you said evolution was a God. because they believe that to be the ultimate causal forces in creation.
So they're okay not answering any of the first cause, first principle questions. They just don't go there.
Yeah, they don't even try to answer those.
Which in and of itself is phenomenal to me. Like, it just always blew my mind. Like, how can you be at peace if you don't get the number one question? How do you think you can figure out the rest? I've never understood. It's such a basic logical mistake. Not even a question of faith.
And that the whole movement is that Tower of Cards. I mean, the whole premise of uploading yourself into a machine is not even possible, right? And even if they think it's possible, there's been all these critiques to their fundamental anthropology. So, for example, there's a famous thought experiment on what's called qualia. So let's just assume functionalism is true, that a mind is a mind as long as it can functionally do the same activity. Well, the problem is human experience has qualia. So the thought experiment is, imagine there's a color scientist. Let's say her name is Susie. And Susie knows everything about colors, and she knows every single scientific detail about the color red, but she's colorblind. Does she know everything about red if she's never subjectively seen the color red? And that right there then highlights that the functionalist definition does not have a place for subjective experience as a point of actual epistemological truth.
Yeah, so experience is, in a sense, it's not even a part of their anthropology. It's not a part of their anthropology, their epistemology. It doesn't matter.
Correct. And that's why that's why they hate postmodernists. You see, because postmodernists say that you have your own truth. The transhumanist says, you guys are idiots. Do you see the AI system I'm building? Like, if I wouldn't do any of this if I was a dumb postmodernist. No, they believe in science. They believe in evolution. They believe in basically the modernist project, you know. And I always say the 5 pillars of modernity is rationalism, individualism, scientism, technological progress, and democracy. These are the 5 things that become novel intellectual movements once we reach the Enlightenment. And so this appeal to democracy all the time. We got to spread democracy. Well, look what that's led to. And notice how all these transhumanists keep talking about how the AI is going to be a better democratic system. The AI is going to regulate our society in a more democratic way.
What effect will World War III and the upcoming growth of the Orthodox Church have on the globalist agenda and transhumanism movement? Will the return to Constantinople negatively impact these? That's an interesting question.
I mean, I haven't speculated on Constantinople being returned to the Greeks as it relates to the transhumanist end goal. I mean, the way that I see it is the paradox of God itself, as we talked about. And correct me, Father, if I'm wrong, because you know probably more than I do about a lot of this stuff. But the general timeline is the World War III occurs. It causes global chaos. During that and after that, we have a golden era of orthodoxy. We may right now be in the beginning of this golden era. Maybe not. Maybe this is something different. So again, we're Orthodox. We don't make these dramatic proclamations about things that are occurring. But
the time is not. We don't focus on the time of things. Yeah. That's really important. We don't know when these things will happen because it depends on repentance, as you said earlier.
Right. So only God knows the time and the day. We are agents. Are repentful agents during this timeline. But World War III occurs, generally divided China, Russia, Iran versus basically NATO, the US, and Israel. We already kind of see those sides divvied up. We don't know when and where, but during that process, orthodoxy is going to spread across the world. I've heard elders say the Orthodox gospel has not reached every corner of the earth. Maybe the gospel, the general gospel has, but not the Orthodox gospel, which is the prerequisite for us to actually enter into the reign of Antichrist. That has to occur first. And so this golden age is the process in which that occurs. And many people, essentially, it's God offering everybody the opportunity again for salvation, that orthodoxy will be on, as you said, the spread on the table. It will be there for everyone if they want that. That is the prerequisite before we get there. So during that process, do I think transhumanism is going to excel and catalyze its effort? Absolutely. That's the whole point of my book, is that these things are going to be in parallel.
Too much further in. Tell us how people can obtain the book.
So at my website, I only sell hard copies. And those are signed. And if there's something in particular you want me to write or as a message, you can put that in the message when you check out on my website. It is a little bit more expensive. It helps me make a little bit more money on each book. But if you want a cheaper, difficult times right now in the economy, you can go to Amazon. So if you just put in Return to Babylon, it'll pop up. Return to Babylon, Adam from Antichrist. Or if you just put in David Patrick Harry, it'll pop up. And they have, there's a Kindle version and then a paperback and a hardback.
Well, we want to support you, and so I encourage everybody to go to the website and get the book from you and get the signed copy and have the hardcover. It's always better to have a hardcover.
So as orthodoxy, the meaning crisis, the post-secular society, as we move forward, orthodoxy is going to grow. That's how I open the book, is highlighting the immense growth of orthodoxy in America, and then the immense fascination and growth and influence of transhumanism in America. So
Yes.
as we move forward, those things are going to become mainstream options. Orthodoxy is already becoming mainstream. I believe it's going to become more and more and more mainstream. And the tension between these is going to be very palpable. A pre-modern mystical Christian worldview versus a modernist rationalist fantasy worldview. And so all that infrastructure is going to be built, I believe, again, correct me, Father, you'd be more insightful than I am, that transhumanist infrastructure is going to be built while orthodoxy is also growing, excelling, converting people all across the world. And then then we get into the stage is set, essentially.
I asked Metropolitan Theophatos years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago, when I was in Greece and I was thinking of coming back to America at the time. I said, help me understand something. I don't understand how this is going to work. I said, there's just prophecies and all this orthodoxy is going to be like it's called an analambi in Greek, which is basically a showing forth of orthodoxy, a mission to the world, etc. How's it going to work if this whole ascent of Antichrist continues and all this globalization continues? And he just kind of stopped and he said, "Well, it's already like that. It's just going to continue." Like he just goes like, "What are you talking about?" It's like, yes, of course they're going to coexist. Now we can't really make sense exactly how it's going to work because this globalist system wants total domination, right? It wants a global monetary system, and I think eventually that will take place. And the prophecies are that this will only be for a time, that there'll be a great mission, and then again there'll be apparently there's some prophecies that say this is going to be an amazing time to live in on many levels. But one of the great temptations will be there will be a great materialistic advancement or the ease for a lot of people, and that will bring again corruption of morals, corruption of and laxity and worldliness and apostasy. So it's a cycle, and we see this throughout church history. That we go through these cycles. I mean, Russia is one of the great examples of the 20th century. You had this ascent of the Russian Empire. You had then the corruption of it through a lot of secularization, Western ideas, worldliness. Dostoevsky saw it all coming. And then the Bolsheviks came, and it was like they felt like they were before the Antichrist. They felt like they were in the time of the Antichrist. It was a type of Antichrist in the 30s, 20s, and 30s. And then they went through this, terrible purification process, then again reborn, Orthodoxy again reborn. So this is not, what we're talking about is not all that crazy. It's happened probably again and again throughout church history. It's going to happen one more time before the end. And it's got to be seen, even though there'll be political side to this whole thing. It's not about that. Right. And it's not about some return to a great empire, or, if people focus on, the Greeks and taking back Constantinople, that is one portion, and it's not the main portion. Christ does everything for the salvation of the world. And of course, it's all about the church being able to be shared across the planet. And I think that it's the same. It's actually a continuation of a process going on for quite some time. And it's a separation of the sheep from the goats. Yeah. It's a clarity, because for the longest time in the West, there was not clarity. There was not an option. It was always two bad choices: papal Protestantism or Reformed Protestantism. That was it. You had to choose both heretical, both, not the church. Now there is an ability to get this, and the dissolution of the Western culture, essentially, and Western Christian vision into this transhumanist thing. It creates a stark choice, two choices that are very starkly opposed. Whereas papal Protestantism and Reformed Protestantism are two sides of the same coin, and it's very murky. Like, whereas this is going to be very stark. And so, when that period ends, when orthodoxy again, people become worldly, and the church fades again toward the end, and the rise of Antichrist, it'll be so stark that the church will be, as it says in Revelation, chased into the wilderness. It'll be impossible for the two to be reconciled. And so it's going to continue like that, and then it's going to end in the descent of Antichrist. Anyway, we're off topic.
And to your point, real quick, just to your point, people always ask me when I do those eschatology streams, well, why are you talking about Antichrist? There's already multiple Antichrists in history. And to your point, yes, they're typologies, they're types of Antichrist. And to your point, it's the same thing. It's the separating the wheat from the chaff. And the difference is, what I always highlight to people, is it's now global, right? The Bolshevik Revolution was localized. Nero and Diocletian were localized. It's still the same process of sifting between the true and the false. The difference now is the digital technology and the digital world we live in is global. That's what makes it different. That's what makes it universal. That's what makes it setting the stage for the true entity who has not arrived yet, but that's where we're moving to. It's now global.
And it has to be for the Antichrist, because we know he's going to be a global leader. There's going to be one world government. There's going to be one world monetary system. And so these have to be types before the end. I think that, but that doesn't mean that, because the Apostle John says there's already Antichrist among us. One of my questions for you was, can you say one of the cornerstones of the whole thing is what St. John said is the essence of the Antichrist, which is a denial of the theanthropic person of Jesus Christ?
Oh, absolutely.
That is a cornerstone to transhumanism, right? There's no believers in the theanthropic nature of Jesus Christ and his church among the transhumanists.
No, because that's who they're going to be.
Right. They are
the incarnated God.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's huge, right? That's another confirmation that this is really going to be the ideology and the utopia promised by the Antichrist.
Yeah. It's apotheosis versus theosis.
Right.
And most people are going to choose apotheosis.